Good evening, afternoon or morning. Movie Cat is at the microphone, and today I will tell you a story about a strong girl who faces violence in a man's world. For your attention, the first film in the MILLENIUM Trilogy, an action-packed detective thriller, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And in order not to lose this channel, I recommend to subscribe. Mikael Blomkvist is a journalist and co-owner of the MILLENIUM magazine. He led the investigation into the affairs of a major Swedish businessman, Wagner, whose sources of income were mostly illegal, including trafficking in drugs, weapons and even people. However, Wagner found out about this and fed the journalist misinformation about himself, and then sued Mikael for libel. The court sentenced the journalist to a large fine and 3 months in prison. However, when exactly to serve his sentence, Mikael can decide for himself. And although MILLENIUM magazine is on the verge of extinction, its owner and Mikael's mistress, Erika Berger, remains optimistic and promises Blomkvist that together they can fix everything. However, Mikael decides to quit, at least for a while, so as not to cast a shadow on the magazine. Lisbeth Salander is a very unusual girl. She is bisexual plus loves tattoos and gothic clothing. Lisbeth is a top-class hacker and works for one of the largest detective agencies in Sweden. She is assigned to check on Mikael Blomkvist because a major industrialist and owner of an entire concern, Henrik Wanger, wants to entrust the journalist with some work. Lisbeth's conclusion: Mikael is pure and honest. Henrik Wanger's lawyer invites Blomkvist to the family estate in Hedebo in northern Sweden. Henrik Wanger invites Blomkvist to solve the mystery of the disappearance of his niece, Harriet Wanger. 40 years ago, in 1966, 16-year-old Harriet disappeared from the absolutely isolated family island of Hedebo. On the morning of that day, she left for the parade in Hedestad, and by lunchtime she returned to the island of Hedebo. Then an accident occurred on the only bridge, so it became impossible to get out of the island unnoticed. But the girl could not drown, because the depth is too shallow and, as a result, everything that falls into the water is then washed ashore. A local newspaper photographer filming the accident by a chance took a photo of Harriet standing by the window. This is the last time anyone saw Harriet. Since numerous members of the Wanger family gathered on the island that day, Henrik assumes that the girl was killed by one of her relatives. For the last 40 years, every year on his birthday, someone sends Henrik a dried flower, like the ones Harriet gave him when she was a child. He suspects that her killer is sending the flowers to mock the old man. Henrik provides all the materials he has, including detailed police reports. Mikael does not believe that he will be able to solve this case after 40 years. But Henrik does not demand it. Henrik is ready to pay a substantial sum just for trying to figure it out, and if successful, he promises to triple the fee. Since Mikael has nothing better to do right now, he agrees. Blomkvist settles in a cottage on the island of Hedebo. He forms the family tree of the Wanger clan. The first person Mikael meets is Martin Wanger, Henrik's nephew and Harriet's brother. Martin is a smart man and, unlike most of his relatives, progressive. It was Martin who headed the Wanger concern when old Henrik decided to retire several years ago. Matron treats Mikael to wine and says that all other relatives are against the journalist looking for something on their island. Martin himself believes that if an old man needs to know the truth, it is his right. Suddenly a howling sound is heard from somewhere below. Martin explains that it is the wind that blows so strongly here in the north. Then the owner of the house goes to the cellar to get more wine. In Hedebo, among the evidence, Mikael finds Harriet's notebook, in which he discovers a list of women with 5-digit numbers next to each name. Retired policeman Gustav, who was in charge of Harriet's case in his youth, suggests that these are telephone numbers, but they could not be associated with names. Despite the fact that Lisbeth Salander is already an adult, she has a guardian assigned to her due to a mental disorder diagnosed in childhood. For a long time, her guardian was an elderly lawyer who was not indifferent to the girl's fate, but he had a stroke. A new guardian, lawyer Niels, begins to control Lisbeth's finances. When Lisbeth approaches him to get money for a new computer, Bierman agrees to give it. But on the condition that she gives him a blowjob. Lisbeth decides to film the next coercion with a hidden camera, which she installs on her backpack. She asks for money for groceries and meets with Bierman at his apartment. However, this time, Bierman does not limit himself to blackmail. but handcuffs her and subjects her to brutal violence. A week later, she makes a new meeting with him at his home, stuns him with a shocker, ties him naked to the bed, and does to him everything that he did to her. Lisbeth also reports that she filmed the last rape on a hidden camera. She promises Bierman that she will send the video to the media and the police if he does not return control of her finances to her and does not help her to be recognized as sane and capable. If suddenly an accident happens to her, the video will be sent automatically, and so that he does not forget about what happened and never ends up in bed with women again. She gives him a tattoo on his stomach, writing in huge letters the phrase, "I am a rapist and a pig." After this, Lisbeth comes home and remotely connects to Mikael's computer. He interested her even at the stage of spying on him. Lisbeth finds a file with the girls' names and 5-digit numbers opposite. She decides to compare these numbers with the numbers of Bible verses, and she is right. Each verse comes from the book of Leviticus and describes the sins of the people and the punishment that must be inflicted on the sinner. The sinner is usually guilty of being a woman, and the punishments amount to stoning to death or having the head severed from the body. After some doubt, Lisbeth sends Mikael an email with this information. Meanwhile, Mikael examines photographs provided by Henrik of the parade in Hedestad, which Harriet attended on the morning of the disappearance. In one photo it is clear that someone scared her. Thanks to photographs from a different angle, Mikael discovers the person who scared Harriet so much is an unknown person in a blue school uniform. Suddenly, Mikael receives an email with a hint that the numbers in Harriet's notebook are verses from the Bible. Excited by a new turn in the investigation, Mikael does not immediately realize that someone has broken into his computer. Suddenly, Henrik has a heart attack, and the Wagner clan asks Mikael to stop investigating their family secrets. However, Henrik's lawyer says Mikael should continue to investigate. In response, Mikael asks the lawyer if he happens to know who could have gotten into his computer. The lawyer guesses that this was done by Lisbeth, whom he hired to test Mikael. Immediately after this, Mikael comes to Lisbeth's apartment to invite her to cooperate with him in finding Harriet's killer. Lisbeth sets up a computer to search databases of Swedish newspapers and matches Bible verses with a series of murders that occurred from the late 1940s to the mid-1960s. At the same time, Lisbeth discovers that all the murdered women had Jewish names. Suspicion falls on members of the Wagner family, most of whom were Nazis at the time. Mikael and Lisbeth rent a car and visit the sites of ritual murders. As a journalist, Mikael each time learns from the local police the details of the murder, which exactly coincide with the verse from the Bible next to the name of the victim. However, there was no way Harriet knew all these women, so what were their names doing in her notebook? She made a list of murdered young women and then disappeared. Harriet must have known who killed them. After visiting 6 murder scenes throughout Sweden, Mikael and Lisbeth return to Hedebo. Lisbeth notices that someone was in their house because the photographs were hung differently and the Bible lay differently. At night, Lisbeth comes to Mikael, seduces him, and they become lovers. Henrik's family again tries to put pressure on Mikael to stop the investigation. They all demand that Mikael get out of their island, and only Martin Wagner is delicate. He invites the journalist to take a break. However, Henrik's lawyer claims that this is not possible because Henrik drew up a contract under which, as long as he is alive, the investigation cannot be terminated. Suddenly, Mikael notices Harriet's cousin, Cecilia Wagner, is wearing Harriet's pendant, so Mikael asks her where it is from. However, Cecilia claims that this is a pendant from Anita Wagner, Harriet's sister, and she got it after Anita's death. The following is known about Anita's fate. Shortly after Harriet's disappearance, she left the island of Hedebo and went to study in London. Anita made a good career there, but died of cancer 7 years later. Lisbeth sits down at the computer to look for information about Anita, and Mikael goes for a run. Suddenly he is shot at in the forest, but he miraculously manages to run out and escape. Mikael begins to seriously suspect 90-year-old Harold Wagner, Henrik's brother, because he is a former Nazi and the victims are Jewish girls. Also, Harold is the only one alive who fits the role of a murderer in the 1940th. Mikael decides to break into Harold's house in search of evidence. There he sees on the walls old photos of Harold among the Wehrmacht officers and his awards from the Third Reich. Suddenly, someone hits Mikael on the head, the light turns on and Harold Wagner stands in front of Mikael. with a gun in his hands, determined to shoot the journalist. However, Martin appears in the room in time and takes the gun from his uncle. Martin takes a sympathetic interest in how Mikael is feeling and invites him over for a drink. Harold shouts after Martin that he doesn't understand how Gottfried could have given birth to such a slug. At his home, Martin treats Mikael to whiskey and asks what the journalist was doing at Harold's house. Mikael reveals that he and Lisbeth found a connection between the murdered girls in Harriet's diary, and the main suspect now is Harold. Mikael also admits that he didn't have time to find anything in the house. But perhaps Lisbeth will have better luck, because she is currently looking through the accounting records of the Wagner company. Suddenly, Mikael, in turn, asks Martin how he ended up in the Harold's house. Meanwhile, Lisbeth discovers that the last victim on the list worked for the Wagner company, so she goes to the Hedestad archive and finds out that Gottfried, the late father of Harriet and Martin, was on a business trip to each city where the murders were committed. However, the last murder occurred in 1967. 2 years after the Gottfried's death. Having found a photo of Gottfried and Martin together in one of the cities where the murder was committed, Lisbeth realizes that his son has followed in his father's footsteps. Martin unexpectedly injects Mikael, and after some time, Mikael wakes up in handcuffs hanging by the neck. Martin frankly enjoys recounting the rape, torture and murder of scores of women over several decades. The girl killed in '67 is considered the last in the series, because Martin then committed his first murder on his own, leaving the body inside as his father taught him. However, Martin liked the process, not his father's ritual show-off, so the next 40 years Martin threw bodies into the sea. The last victim was in his basement right on the evening when Martin first invited Mikael to meet him and drink wine. Lisbeth leaves the archive and returns back to Hedeby, but she does not find Mikael in the house. When Lisbeth checks the security cameras, she sees that Martin came to their house, so she rushes to him. Martin easily admits that he is a serial rapist and maniac, but he denies the murder of his sister Harriet. Martin offers Mikael some water, and when Mikael begins to hope that he will be able to escape, Martin admits that this is his favorite moment, when the victim still believes he will survive. Suddenly Lisbeth sneaks up and hits Martin on the head with a golf club, knocking him down. While Lisbeth frees Mikael, Martin comes to his senses, escapes from the basement, gets behind the wheel and drives off. Lisbeth grabs the gun Martin left behind and chases him on her motorcycle. Martin's car crashes at high speed. Lisbeth approaches and watches as the stranded, crippled Martin burns, and then the overturned car explodes and Martin dies in the fire. Mikael calls the police, tells them everything and shows Martin's basement. Lisbeth admits to Mikael that she could have saved Martin Wanger from the burning car, but she did not want to. Then she leaves. In the house, Mikael finds a note from Lisbeth which says that there are two Anita Wanger. One died long ago, and the other lives in Australia. Without hesitation, Mikael goes there. Meanwhile, Lisbeth decides to visit her mother in the hospital for the first time. The mother understands why her daughter did not come earlier, because long ago she chose a very bad man who, in her own words, greatly offended her and Lisbeth. Mikael returns to Hedeby and tells Henrik Wanger that he has a surprise. But first he asks his employer to promise not to have a heart attack. Mikael invites Harriet into his office. Henrik recognizes her immediately and cannot hold back his tears. The first thing Harriet says is that she has been sending a dried flower on paper all these years to remind her uncle that she is alive and doing well. She could not even think that Henrik would convince himself that the killer was mocking him in such a way. Next, Harriet explains why she had to run away from home. When she turned 14, her own father Gottfried began regularly raping her. When she was already 15, she finally hit him on the head with an oar, and he fell into the lake and, being very drunk, could no longer get out of the water. Martin saw all this and now he started to rape her, until Henrik sent him to study in Uppsala. When Martin returned on the day of the parade, Harriet fled Sweden with Anita's help, fearing a repeat of the violence. In Australia, Harriet began a new life with the papers of her sister Anita, and Anita took her husband's surname. Mikael, having solved this complicated case, receives a substantial fee and decides that now he can afford to serve the 3 months in prison assigned to him for libel. One day Lisbeth visits him and gives him a large bag of papers. When Lisbeth leaves, Mikael discovers in the package complete dirt on vanished Rome. the dishonest businessman, because of whom Mikael ended up in prison. Bank accounts, subsidiary companies, hidden offshore companies, everything that connects Wennerstrom with the illegal trade in drugs, weapons and even people. After leaving prison, Mikael dedicated the entire new issue of Millennium to Wennerstrom. A week later, Wennerstrom is found murdered in Spain. Celebrating the successful sale of the magazine issue at the editorial office, Mikael sees on the news that the Economic Crime Investigation Department has discovered that several million were withdrawn from one of Wennerstrom's accounts after his death. The police suspect an unknown woman who was caught on a surveillance camera in one of the banks. Mikael takes a closer look and recognizes her. Meanwhile, Lisbeth changes her hairstyle, hair color, clothing style and goes on a trip around the world. Thank you for watching. If you are wondering how Lisbeth became such an unusual girl and why she was declared incompetent, this will be discussed in the retelling of the second part of the Millennium Trilogy. To support the channel, like, write any number of comments and be sure to subscribe if you have not already.